Good evening. I want to thank each of you for your presence tonight. John warned you several times that I was going to teach, and you guys showed up anyway. So I appreciate that very much. I also hope you have a lot of comments because there's only 13 verses in this chapter, and we may be done in about 5 minutes. Tonight we're going to study Hebrews chapter 5. Before we begin chapter 5, I would like to review the last few verses of chapter 4. Todd has stated several times how these chapters tend to build on each other, and I certainly agree with that. So with that thought in mind, let's turn to chapter 4, and we'll be looking at verses 14 through 16. I'm going to read those passages. Since then, we have a great high priest who has passed through the heavens, Jesus, the Son of God. Let us hold fast our confession. For we do not have a high priest who is unable to sympathize with our weaknesses, but one who in every respect has been tempted as we are, yet without sin. Let's stop there for a minute. I really want you to think about particularly verse 14, or verse 15 rather, when it talks about, for we do not have a high priest who is unable to sympathize with our weaknesses. What's that saying?
He knows what we're going through.
How does he know?
He's been here doing that.
He lived it.
You know, I've been thinking a lot about that verse for the last several days. And to me, it's one of those things that we've read so many times that it seems to lose significance. It's almost, to me, like the Lord's Supper. Keith did an incredible job, I thought, presenting the Lord's Supper, leading the Lord's Supper. When we think about what it means to us, how incredibly important it is in our life, and the incredible sacrifice, it's almost overwhelming. But 52 times a year, year after year after year, we do the same thing, roughly. And it's easy to let the sheer repetition of that affect the importance. And I think this thought is like that.
You know, that's what the denominational world says. We don't want to do it. It'll get to be just something we do every week. So we'll only do it 3 times a year. But that's not what the Bible says. It says every week.
You know, and once you start down that path of doing things because you want to do them a certain way, where do you stop? You don't. But nonetheless, I think we have to really, and we're going to talk about later in the chapter 5, how we have to be mature enough to understand. But I think it takes effort. I think it takes work. I think it takes concentration. And I want to think about, once again, the fact that Jesus was human. He walked this existence in the flesh. How many of you have ever been so worried about something, so anxious, that you felt a knot of fear in your stomach that made it almost hard to breathe? I think if we're honest, all of us have. Some of us more than others. Jesus felt that. Our high priest felt that. He knows exactly how we feel in certain situations because he felt the same way. When you think about it, it truly is an incredibly personal thing to think about. When we talk all the time about Jesus died for us. He died for each of us individually. He lived his life and experienced all these emotions and feelings that we feel every day. How incredibly fortunate are we that he is our great high priest and more. 1 John chapter 2, verse 1 reads, "My little children, I am writing these things so that you may not sin. But if anyone does sin, we have an advocate with the Father, Jesus Christ the righteous." Well, what's an advocate?
Person who speaks for you.
Someone will stand up for you. Intercede.
That's exactly right. Webster says one who defends or maintains a cause is one definition. Another is one who pleads the cause of another. I think both of those are very apt. Think about the fact that a person who has felt what we feel, who knows what we go through, is our advocate. Whenever I was a young attorney, I was an assistant district attorney and learned a lot about life. A lot of it I wasn't too impressed with, to be honest, but I learned a lot. One of the things I learned right off was the importance of a good advocate. In Bryan County in those days, they had a public defender, and I don't know about now, this is not my area of specialty, but back then, that was a job that a lot of folks didn't want to do, and there was a gentleman that was pretty much, I'd have to say he was at least 80, and he was known to fall asleep every now and then during a trial. And you'd look over there and he'd be nodding off. And I can remember so well how he would sometimes say things that didn't really make sense. And I thought, boy, how scary that would be to have him as your advocate. There may be some folks somewhere down the road that thought the same thing about me. I don't know. But nonetheless, we have Jesus as our advocate.
Thinking about myself, I think one of the greatest burdens could have been just the fact that he knew when and how he was going to die.
That's kind of hard to wrap your mind around, isn't it? That he knew all along. Be incredibly difficult.
I know it wouldn't be for me. I wouldn't want to know the day it's going to happen.
No, and we know, and we're going to talk about it later in the lesson, how he prayed that that cup might pass from him.
He had the power, the authority to call them angels down there and save him. But he didn't do it.
Yeah, that's love and sacrifice that it it's hard for us to even comprehend. It really is. And it's something we should never take for granted, even though I fear that oftentimes we do, just for the simple fact that it's something we think about every week. I'd like to read a sentence or two from the Burton commentary, and I have to confess, I like to read some of the paragraphs and some of the thoughts directly out of the commentary because they word them far better than I could ever do. So I'd like to read this short passage. Far from feeling that our great high priest, so far removed from the heavens, is, from so vast a separation, incapable of proper sympathy for suffering and tempted Christians, the believer is invited to see that Jesus, the Son of God, knows all about human problems, even temptation, and that he is thereby qualified to provide the utmost sympathy and understanding for human weakness. What's that old saying? Don't judge someone till you've walked a mile in their shoes or moccasins or whatever the saying goes. There's a lot of wisdom in that. He's walked more than a mile. He knows. And the last passage in that chapter basically talks about how we can, because Jesus is our high priest and our advocate, we can go boldly before the throne. We know that he knows about us. We know that he cared enough to willingly undergo what he went through. And that knowledge gives us confidence to know that we can boldly go before the throne if we've been obedient. We'll talk about that a little more too. Any thoughts before we move on to chapter 5? The first section of this chapter deals with the authority and honor of Christ's priesthood. Hebrews was written to Jewish Christians in Palestine. These people had grown up their entire lives holding the Jewish high priest in extreme reverence. And it was difficult for them to understand that Jesus exceeded any Jewish high priest. I'd like to read a quick insert. Without doubt, the earthly splendor of the Jewish high priest was a factor of seductive influence on Christians, especially those of Jewish background. His rich robes, the extravagantly ornate breastplate, the unique privilege of entering the Holy of Holies on the Day of Atonement, his status as judge and president of the Sanhedrin, his dramatic influence of the official representative of the Jewish nation, more especially at a time when they had no king, the traditional descent of the office from the sons of Aaron and reaching all the way back to Exodus, and the grudging respect paid to the office even by Roman conquerors. All these things and many others elevated the Jewish high priest to a position of isolated splendor in the eyes of the people. Let's look at the first 4 verses of chapter 5. For every high priest chosen from among men is appointed to act on behalf of men in relation to God, to offer gifts and sacrifice for sins. He can deal gently with the ignorant and wayward, since he himself is beset with weakness. Because of this, he is obligated to offer sacrifice for his own sins, just as he does for those of the people. And no one takes this honor for himself, but only when called by God, as Aaron was. Well, right off, the first 4 verses, the author of Hebrews is basically setting the stage to explain why Jesus is so far above any earthly high priest. And once again, keep in mind that these people had held that position in extreme reverence their whole lives. It's not hard for us to understand this concept if you've ever tried to teach someone who grew up in a denomination. I've had people, particularly one young girl I recall back in my college days, say, well, what about my parents? You know, they didn't believe this. They don't believe this. And all you can say is, well, this is what the Bible says. You need to decide for yourself what you think is right to do.
Judy's dad taught a man one time, and when he got through, this guy told Judy, he said, I know what you're saying is true, but I can't go against my dad. His dad was a Baptist preacher.
Think about what he really said.
Yeah.
He basically said he was willing to risk his eternal soul or lose his eternal soul because he didn't want to upset his dad. Now, I know my dad would have said, for me to do what I thought was right, now he would have talked long and loud to convince me that what he thought was right was the way it ought to be. But in the end, I think he would have told me to do as my conscience dictated. And each one of us has to decide what we think is right. And we'll talk more about that later too. And how we have to train ourselves to have the ability to know what's right. And how that doesn't come easy or by accident. Real quickly, in the first couple verses, there are several qualifications that are listed. He should be taken from among the people, appointed by God, have tender compassion for those whom he represented, possess an adequate sacrifice, and refrain from taking such an honor unto himself. You know, verse 2 says he can deal gently with the ignorant and wayward, since he himself is beset with weakness. Well, that's definitely talking about a earthly high priest. And you know, I read quite a bit about the high priesthood of the Jews, and quite honestly, there was a significant number of them that were bad people. In fact, the high priest in Jesus' day, the whole Sanhedrin council was sitting around trying to figure out how to kill Jesus in violation of the law. So, unfortunately, when you're dealing with high priests that are human, they are beset with sins and temptations just like any other human. And every other person that has walked this earth except Jesus has sinned. So they weren't immune from sin at all. In fact, in verse 3, it talks about the fact that a human high priest is obligated to offer sacrifice for his own sins, because once again, he was human. But Jesus is it comes from a totally different situation. He was sinless. Verse 5. So also Christ did not exalt himself to be made a high priest, but was appointed by him who said to him, You are my son, today I have begotten you. Well, obviously, God had the power to appoint a high priest for all mankind. And the office of the Jewish priesthood was divinely scheduled to expire and dissipate with the coming of Christ. There was no longer a need for a high priest of the Jews, because Christ was a high priest of everyone. In verse 6, the author goes on to basically set the stage to explain how Christ could not only be our high king, but also our high priest, because those two offices were totally separate under the Jewish law. Psalms 110 verse 4 explains this in that it was prophesied that Jesus would be a high priest after the order of Melchizedek, as we look at in verse 6. Who was Melchizedek?
Way back in the Old Testament,
That's true.
Abraham was paying him tribute or spoils of war.
As he was coming back from a victorious.
Battle for Lot.
Correct. Scripture says he was the king of Salem, and he was also a priest. And he doesn't, so that basically when Jesus was foretold or prophesied to be a high priest after the order of Melchizedek, was saying that he was going to be our high king and our high priest. And that's different. He's also not of the lineage of Aaron, which was different than the Jews were used to. So this statement would have helped reconcile in their mind how Jesus could be both. And once again, it's not hard for us to understand that he's both, but we weren't raised as a Jew with the Jewish hierarchy of the high priest coming from the Levites and all of that from our earliest recollection.
You know, we don't know in the patriarch time how those priests were selected. We just don't, we aren't given that information.
Didn't they come from the firstborn? I mean, it started with Aaron, and his firstborn was supposed to be high priest, and then his son's firstborn was supposed to be high priest.
I don't know for sure, to be honest.
I'm actually talking about before law of Moses. You know, Melchizedek. We really don't know how God,
Mhm.
you know, it almost seems like there was such a direct communication that maybe there was a designation by God for who would be the priest, because we don't know there was a lineage. You know, you weren't born. We also give some insight that maybe Job had some sort of priestly benefit to his people with his kids and everything. So, you know, we just don't know that much. But obviously, when the Jewish law, Mosaic law came, there was a definite tribe that was designated in Aaron.
Correct.
And, you know, and then all of a sudden, it all changes. So it goes to that, and the law changes. The law changed to Mosaic law. That's when we got the priests. So there was some way that God chose a priest before Mosaic law, and now Jesus is like it. He's the final high priest.
Melchizedek tells me that someone worshipped God before we think about it.
Now that's an interesting insight.
Because he was a priest, and he was prior to the times that we're enlightened about.
And Abraham recognized that, didn't he? He had to.
He had to. And we don't know where he came from, but he was there.
Now that's a really interesting insight. I hadn't really thought of it from that angle before.
Yeah, it says he was without father or mother.
We don't know his ancestry. That's a fact.
But in chapter 7, verse 1, says
Certainly does.
And that's prior to the rest of the knowledge that we're given.
And I don't know who has chapter 7, but they're going to get into Melchizedek fairly heavily. And it's very interesting, and the author of Hebrews uses, obviously he was inspired, but he uses the prophecy that Jesus would be after the order of Melchizedek to help the Jews understand.
So he goes back, Melchizedek goes back to be respected by the Jews before their father.
Which also ties into another thing the Jews love to do is trace their lineage way back. And so here the author of Hebrews is saying, well, you can go way, 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 way back. Jesus is like Melchizedek in a sense. The word Melchizedek, by the way, means king of righteousness. And once again, when we hit chapter 7, we're going to learn a lot more about Melchizedek. And verse 6 talks about that, it says, you are a priest forever after the order of Melchizedek. When it says forever, what does that mean? Pretty straightforward, I think. Does Jesus have a successor? No. You know, the Jews had to have a system set up where the priesthood came from a specific tribe, and Jesus did away with all that. There is no successor. He is the high priest forever and ever and ever. From what I understand, and correct me if you think I'm wrong, but I believe the Jewish lineage records were destroyed by the Romans, and they don't even know who is from the tribe of Levite right now. So there's no way that there could be a high priest from the tribe of Levite, since they don't know who's a Levite. So that's,
They were destroyed in Jerusalem.
I believe so, yes. I don't know how, I have no idea what their thinking is, how they rationalize.
There was altogether 83 priests from Aaron down to Phineas,
83 high priests.
over 1,700 years of service.
Some of them must have lived a pretty good lick. Fortunately, we don't have to worry about any of those anymore because there's only one now.
Right.
That's interesting, though. Let's look at verse 7. In the days of his flesh, Jesus offered up prayers and supplications with loud cries and tears to him who was able to save him from death, and he was heard because of his reverence. You know, obviously this passage is talking about when Jesus was in the Garden of Gethsemane and he was praying for the crucifixion not to have to happen. And God heard his prayers, but he didn't allow it to change. And Jesus himself willingly allowed it to happen.
And we see his, we see that he was the man, because, I mean, he's asking this cut be taken. So there's a contemplation in his head at least about trying to avoid this. And so, I mean, that makes him so human. He makes the right decision, and he goes forward with the plan, but there was contemplation about not going forward with it there.
There obviously was.
Yeah, and when we talk about temptations, you have to think about things. You can't just say, oh, it never even entered his mind not to fall for any of Satan's schemes. Well, he wasn't tempted then. So there's always that, humanness that really sets in, and we can understand that too, even though we have that urge to do a this certain sin and contemplate it, just don't give into it and you won't sin. You'll be tempted, but you won't sin.
Excellent comment. And I would have to say, most of us are quite gifted at rationalizing things. And if we were looking down the road at being crucified, we could probably come up with quite a lengthy list of reasons why that needed to change or shouldn't have to happen.
Well, wasn't it when Christ was in the garden, after, didn't angels come and attend to him?
I don't think it was then.
There was one time, when.
Yeah, there was one time. I think it was right after the three temptations.
After the
Yeah.
Yeah,
temptation.
they didn't attend to
Yeah,
him.
that's right. I remember that.
Well, the commentary made a comment that while God doesn't always answer our prayers the way we want them to be answered, sometimes he strengthens our heart to be able to endure whatever it may be that we have to. You know, that may be an answer to a prayer that we don't understand or realize.
I've had that several times, but if we keep our hearts open, we'll see why God did that. Or maybe in our own minds, understand, like, years later, why it was good that that door didn't open for you.
And the older you get, I think that often the more you understand. And sometimes it does take years to really be able to think, you know, that worked out way better for me than what I was thinking. Yep, that's a good point.
And God heard him when he was making these pleas for the cup to be taken from him. I mean, and, you know, it's not like you're listening to somebody, but you're not paying attention. God was really paying attention to him. And so we can take part in that, you know, God's always there. Maybe we're not praying right. Maybe we even know we're not praying right, but he's listening. He's listening. You know, we might have a prayer for our kids that we want certain things to happen. We know it's not probably right, but we understand they're going to benefit in the future as a result of something, you know, and he hears it. But, you know, like you said, he probably doesn't give us the right answer that we want. I shouldn't say right answer. The one answer we want, because it's not the right answer.
And oftentimes it's not, well, always, it's not the best answer for us either, even though it's what we want. That's a good point. Verse 8, although he was a son, he learned obedience through what he suffered. Now, it's kind of interesting that usually people learn obedience through the disastrous consequences of their disobedience. But it wasn't so with Jesus. From the very first, he displays absolute and perfect obedience. Most of us have to learn the hard way.
That's what I'm saying. I learned obedience from my dad. Or you got a razor strap used on you.
You know,
And then made me so.
my brother Russ was the hardest-headed fella I think I've ever seen. I distinctly remember when he was a little bitty boy, we were sitting in the living room, and he was looking at an electric outlet. And he started reaching over there, and Dad was watching him. Dad said, "Don't you touch that." And he just reached out and tapped it with his finger. Well, he earned himself a whipping. He didn't get shocked. He may have got worse. And I don't recall him ever touching an electrical outlet again. But you couldn't tell him. He had to experience the consequences. Unfortunately for us, the consequences of disobedience are too horrible to contemplate. If you really believe it, it's too horrible to even think about. I say that, we need to think about it so we won't do it. Verse 10, or verse 9. And being made perfect, he became the source of eternal salvation to all who obey him. Verse 10. And there again, I wanted to talk a little bit about verse 9. The last part of that. To all who obey him. What does that say? What does that mean?
It means that some are not gonna obey. We have a choice to make.
I was watching television yesterday, and I was watching a YouTube show about a podcast about a rock show in Tucson, Arizona. And just out of the blue, some guy pops up and he says something about Jesus Christ being our Savior, and I kind of perked up, and he said, I've got this pamphlet right here, and it'll tell you what prayer to make, and once you make it, you're going to heaven, and you don't have to worry about it anymore. Can you? He hadn't really read that passage, I don't think.
And look at what's waiting on him when God considers all the people he deceived.
What do you think Billy Graham will feel when he stands before God and God asks him how come he caused thousands upon
Countless thousands.
people to lose their soul?
And Joseph Smith.
You know, I don't have an answer to that.
But this sentence that you just read in verse 9 is so reassuring for those who choose.
For those who obey him. That's exactly right. And you know, that's not a complicated passage, is it? It seems pretty straightforward to me. And you know, I don't right off recall that verse. I imagine some of you here do, that talks about ye are fallen from grace. The folks that think that, you know, once you've taken Jesus into your own heart, then you don't have to do anything else or worry about it ever again because you're going straight to heaven. Scripture doesn't say that. In fact, it tells us exactly otherwise. Verse 11. About this we have much to say, and it is hard to explain since you have become dull of hearing. What do you think it means when it says dull of hearing?
They better go with one ear and out the other.
My wife would probably have some comments about being dull of hearing.
I've taught a bunch of kids like that.
I don't think it means that you actually need a hearing aid. I don't think it means you have a physical problem with your hearing. I think sometimes you can hear something so often that you just don't really pay attention to it. Or you don't really want to know what's being said, so you don't pay attention to it. And I think we all fall into that category from time to time. Verse 12. For though by this you ought to be teachers, you need someone to teach you again the basic principles of the oracle of God. You need milk, not solid food. Now, what I want to stress here is it doesn't say skip the basic principles. In fact, it reiterates the fact that some of us need to be taught the basic principles again. So they're important. It doesn't say that, don't worry about those, move on. We have to learn the basic principles and then move on. For everyone who lives on milk is unskilled in the word of righteousness, since he is a child. And I'm out of time, so I want to move on quickly to verse 14. But solid food is for the mature, for those who have their powers of discernment trained by constant practice to distinguish good from evil. Now, I want to focus the next few minutes on that last phrase. For those who have their powers of discernment trained by constant practice to distinguish good from evil. Somebody tell me what that means to them.
Well, if you've studied the Bible, you ought to know what is good to do and what is evil to do.
You're not,
I think we learned more and more as we get older.
well, and I think this passage teaches us that we have to build on what we learn as we go along, and it doesn't happen without study and without reading the Bible. And that if we don't, we're not going to be able to distinguish good from evil.
Train your conscience, train your children's conscience, to see what's right and what's not right.
That's true.
Well, and in today's society, it means when you see that pop up on your screen or you hear it on TV, turn the channel. Don't accept it. Don't let it go. Turn it.
It is fascinating how you can be minding your own business. I like to read the sports news. I read everything I can about Oklahoma. The University of Oklahoma, let me be specific. And I can be reading in my iPad, minding my own business, and then a screen pops up about how to date Ukrainian women. Or it's just, it's amazing. And I don't know how in the world, I don't know who sent that. And trust me, I have never dated a Ukrainian woman. I've been happily married for 40 years. So I don't understand that, but that's a perfect example of what you're talking about.
You know, click on it. Yep.
I never have clicked on it.
That's the thing. You make the choice.
But evil, Satan uses tools that we're not aware of.
And it's subtle, you know, because you could easily click on that, just think, well, what are they talking about? And I have no idea. In fact, first time I saw that, I went and talked to my wife, showed it to her, and said, hey, I did not ask how to date Ukrainian women. Anyway,
But somebody knows how to put that kind of stuff in there, and it's fine with them. And they're probably getting paid for it.
well, and that and much worse.
Yeah.
And, you know, you have to train yourself not to be tempted to hit those things. And I'm not on TikTok, but I hear horrible things about TikTok. I talked to a woman today, a good friend of mine, whose grandchild saw something on TikTok about some weird deal where you could make yourself pass out, and she did it. She's 13, and she did it and passed out, and they thought she was dead.
Oh, my goodness.
And she videotaped it to put it on TikTok. At any rate, I digress. Thank you very much. We'll start with chapter 6 next week.